Hi, I'm Pastor Jenny Avisher, and I'm here today with
Pastor Jason Antley.
And together with Deacon Lexanne Graves, we serve as the leadership support team for the South Carolina Synod. We've been working together for a number of years trying to help you have compensation guidelines. And we bring these guidelines to our Synod Council, who votes on them, and then, of course, you all get to vote on them each year at Synod Assembly. We developed this video hoping to help you all better use the guidelines with one another and to answer some of your questions.
And we just want to let you know that these guidelines are available on the Synod website at scsynod.com.
Yeah.
So we're going to get started with a brief introduction of guidelines.
This tool is intended to guide these conversations and to give insight into what's fair and reasonable for trained, approved, and called ministers of our church. We recognize that for some congregations, there will be a need to grow towards compensation recommendations, and we pray that this document fosters ongoing and open communication between rostered ministers, their congregations, for the purpose of fair compensation.
These compensation guidelines focus on deacons who are called by the church to be ministers of word and service, and pastors who are called by the church to be ministers of word and sacrament. Guidelines do not cover any employee of the church that is hired by the church council, such as administrative assistants, sextons, organists, etc. The compensation guidelines for organists can be found at www.alcm.org.
Just a note about how these compensation guidelines were created. We inherited a one-page compensation guideline that simply said a person coming out of seminary should start at $35,000, and congregations were expected to determine housing based on the costs in their area of the state. The guidelines also presumed that congregations would give annual cost of living raises and would consider years of experience in determining any additional compensation. But what we learned is that most congregations were not considering those factors and ended up truly challenged by what is fair and just compensation for years of experience. As a result, we created a chart with increases recommended for years of experience.
The leadership support team worked on compensation guidelines for over 2 years, keeping in contact with Synod Council at every step. We researched other synods with similar demographics. We researched other denominations, and we found that the educational requirements for pastors and deacons was similar to a middle school principal or a high school assistant principal, so we researched pay scales for those positions as well.
The amount of increase for each year of experience was based on the cost of living increase over a 30 years period, which was 2.5%. When you're considering compensation, you want to think about a few things. 1, is this person a second career pastor or deacon who brings other ministry experience?
Number 2, will you be calling other additional leaders so that areas of responsibility will be shared?
3, does your called leader have significant student debt from seminary?
And number 4, does your called leader come with additional educational credentials?
There's a place in the guidelines to offer additional funds for any of the above if you wish to do so. Highlights from the compensation guidelines.
A lot of people like to go directly to Appendix A in the document, but we encourage you to read the entire document because it's more helpful in its entirety. There are many resources within the compensation guidelines which benefit both the rostered minister and the congregation.
This leadership support team has shared workshops about how to use compensation guidelines across the Synod over the last several years. We'd like to include some highlights on this video that we feel can help everyone using these guidelines.
Housing. Housing costs vary from one area to another. Generally, housing is figured at 30% of base salary, but you may need to consider increasing that percentage depending on where you live and the cost of living in that area. The guidelines document gives you a resource to check cost of housing in every area of our state.
We want to clarify some misconceptions about housing as extra pay. Housing's not extra pay, but a part of a pastor's compensation set aside for the purpose of tax benefit, which is allowed by the government.
Once base salary and housing allowance is calculated, then the rostered minister, in consultation with their CPA, can designate any additional funds from base salary which may be needed to cover their housing expenses.
We highly recommend that a rostered minister consult a CPA.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some pastors can and do live in parsonages, but even in those circumstances, we ask that a housing equity allowance be set up to help the rostered minister build an account to have something toward housing when she or he retires and has to buy a home.
Social Security allowance. The congregation is asked to pay for both the employer and the employee parts of Social Security allowance. If you withhold for your pastor and send this payment indirectly, you pay at 15.3%.
If you pay it to your pastor and do not withhold, you pay at 16.459% because you're compensating your pastor for the taxes he or she will owe by receiving this as payment.
And 403B or tax shelters, consult a CPA.
Absolutely. Sick leave and parenting leave. It is best to communicate all expectations ahead of time instead of waiting until it's needed. It is important to be fair and just in the ways we treat one another. It's helpful to set an example of what God teaches us instead of comparing everything to the world's standards.
Yeah. Vacation time. 4 weeks and 4 Sundays are standard for all rostered ministers.
Auto expenses. These can be paid in lump sum or according to the IRS reimbursement. Work out with your rostered minister what works best for you.
Continuing education is important for all of our rostered leaders. The standard recommendation is 2 weeks, 2 Sundays, and at least $1,100.
Every rostered minister needs to stay fresh and continue learning in order to be an effective leader for the church. The rostered minister gets to choose how they wish to spend this time and money, but it should be for continued learning experiences.
Professional expenses. Professional expenses can include a variety of things that a deacon or pastor must participate in. Some congregations create an expense line separate from compensation, which is established and agreed upon for meetings such as Synod Assembly and Convocation. First call theological education. This is required for all pastors and deacons in their first 3 years of ministry. If you call a first call rostered minister, please allow them the time and the funding to participate in this. In South Carolina, we have 5 days that we're involved in between September and May. The South Carolina Synod pays for half of the fees and covers lunches during these events. The minister and congregation are asked to pay the other half of the fees. First Call Theological Education seeks to support and encourage leaders by providing continuing education and building collegial support networks.
Severance. We want to remind you that deacons and pastors are called positions rather than hired employees. All calls are worked through the office of the bishop, and any changes in call must be discussed with the deacon or the pastor and the bishop, which means a called deacon or pastor cannot be removed without consultation with the bishop.
Part-time and interim and supply pastors. Any of the following needs to be in consultation with the office of the bishop. Part-time calls, interim ministry. In the event that a congregation or agency is calling a deacon or pastor to be part-time ministry, it's important to be mindful that you have a legal responsibility to allow that minister to find gainful employment in other parts of their time. And their other employment hours may make it impossible for them to be available for emergency situations during those times. If you're in need of a supply pastor, contact the Synod website, www.scsynod.com. for a list of those who are available to supply. If you need additional assistance with this, feel free to call the Synod office. We recommend that you plan for your supply at least 4 weeks in advance or more for after holidays, if at all possible, and barring emergencies. Information about the costs for a supply pastor are included in the compensation guidelines document.
Sabbaticals. There is significant information in our compensation guidelines document for sabbaticals, and we encourage pastors and deacons to read these, as sabbaticals have proven to be significant times of growth and rejuvenation.
Appendixes. Appendix A gives the information needed to calculate defined compensation for your rostered minister. Defined compensation is base salary plus housing plus Social Security. Additional benefits such as health benefits and pension, etc., are calculated on top of defined compensation. You might want to check out our other video on how to calculate compensation for your rostered minister using your Excel spreadsheet.
Appendix B is an excellent mutual ministry process that is designed to be used by both congregations and rostered ministers in evaluating their year together. We encourage you to take a look at that.
And Appendix C gives you a sample application for sabbatical. In Appendix D, you'll find instructions for the online Excel compensation worksheets. And again, you're going to benefit from seeing our video in this process.
Appendix E are the compensation worksheets in a Microsoft Word document fashion. We've created a Word document on frequently asked questions from across the Synod, and we hope this video and that document, along with our second video on how to use the Excel spreadsheet, is helpful to you in fostering conversation between rostered minister and congregation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, Pastor Jason Antley, or my
me,
friend,
Pastor Jenny Abisher,
or Deacon Lexanne Graves with any questions.
Thank you so much for your attention and blessings on your conversations with one another about compensation.